remember Costco co-founder, director, and former CEO Jim Sinegal, don't you? Jim is one of the good 1%ers. You recall Jim's speech at the Democratic National Convention, which we all watched religiously. You remember that, don't you? You remember how he said that President Obama was a president making an economy to last, and that in order for that to happen, the conditions have to be right, and that requires something from all of us. In other words, people, especially you rich people like me, have to step up to the collectivist status plate and patriotically and cheerfully pay those higher taxes for the greater good, of course. So says Costco former CEO Jim Sinegal. Let's bring in my friends Scott Ott and Steve Green to see if they can spot the difference between rhetoric and reality. Shh. Steve and Scott, you remember this great man and his unselfish, magnanimous appeal for rich people to carry the higher burden for the good of all of us, right? Well, as it turns out, Mr. Sinegal borrowed just a wee bit of company money, $3.5 billion. That's $3,500 million he borrowed in order to pay dividends and bonuses to the rich 1%ers in Costco. Now, why did he borrow that money? Well, he did it so he could pay it now instead of a month from now. Now, why would he do that? Well, because a month from now, all of the higher tax rates that he told us it was our duty to cheerfully pay will actually kick in. Scott, Mr. Sinegal will get about $14 million in bonus money. Taking it now at the 15% existing tax rate, he'll get to keep about $12 million of that. But by not borrowing the money and taking it later at the new 43.4% tax rate, he'd only get to keep about $8 million. That's $4 million that President Obama could have used to build an economy that will last. Any comment on that, Scotty?
Well, I mean, what can you say about that? It makes total sense to me. I mean, he's maintaining his fiduciary responsibility to his company, and he's keeping his word to his political party. Not so much at that point. I mean, I don't mind if these guys, obviously, you're responsible. If you're a CEO or chairman of the board of a company, you're responsible to make sure that your shareholders get the best possible return they can legally on their money, and that's fine. But to then put on this show and stand up at the Democrat National Convention and make it seem like you're really on board with this president, you know, that whole, when we watch that video, people need to go back and watch that. He is reading that speech off the podium as if there is somebody standing just off camera with a Kalashnikov pointed at his chest.
I don't know if I believe that. I think he actually thinks this is a way for him to make himself. It's a way to make himself and his company looks good. So let's take Scotty's advice. Let's actually listen to some of that speech. Here you go.
But at our company, we recognize that job creation requires time and investment and commitment to the long term. It requires companies that plant and grow, not executives who reap and run.
Well, I feel better now. Steve, if you didn't know better, a fellow might suspect that Mr. Sinegal borrowed that money. You guys are both sitting down, right? Specifically, in order to avoid paying the higher taxes he exhorted all of us to pay. Boy, you know, if you didn't know better and know the goodness in his heart, that would sound an awful lot like somebody who plans to reap and run.
You know what the fact is? Nobody pays high taxes. Nobody pays high taxes. Paul Krugman a couple of weeks ago said he wants to bring back the top 91% tax rate from the 50s because everything was hunky-dory in the 50s, so let's bring back the tax rate and everything will be hunky-dory today. What he neglects to tell you is nobody paid that top 91% rate. The tax code was full of loopholes. Businesses found different ways to funnel benefits to their executives so that it didn't count as income. Nobody paid these high rates. It just didn't happen. So what I would like to propose is a deal. We will give you the higher tax rates that you think people over $250,000 a year should pay. And we will eliminate all exemptions for those tax rates. None of them. You want a tax rate of 91%, buddy? You're going to pay it. But listen to him howl then.
I know this is a little ad hominem, but if there's anybody who deserves it, it's him. Krugman is known not to have any friends. He's not a very likable guy, and there's a picture of him holding his cat in what he called for that 91% tax rate. And frankly, his cat thinks it's nonsense, thinks it's utter nonsense. Scott, what's the real explanation here? Because to look at this on its face, this seems to be one of the worst forms of bald-faced hypocrisy I've ever seen. What real explanation can you offer to our progressive friends to explain what's really going on here?
Well, I think what's really going on, and frankly, if the Republican Party would come to understand this, is the intimate relationship that goes on between corporations and politicians, to the point
That's
where
it.
corporations are willing to do almost anything and say almost anything to prop up those politicians who will do almost anything and say anything to make the corporate guys think that they're supportive of them. And so once they get into bed with these people, there's no getting out. Things are going to get ugly at that point. If the Republicans would stand up and say, we are not for favoritism for anybody. If there's a deal on taxes, it should apply to everybody. If whatever kind of regulation we make should apply to everybody. We're not going to make all these little special pigeonhole deals for different people. If the Republicans got out of bed with big businesses, they would show the people that they really, really are for the little guy.
But that would mean, following it to its logical conclusion, Scott, that would mean that Mr. Sinegal basically gave that speech in order to provide President Obama some sort of political cover in order to raise taxes, and that he would have expected something in return from the government. And frankly, if that were true, that would utterly destroy my utter confidence in the progressive agenda. I'm conflicted and confused. Steve, this little move that Mr. Sinegal made actually downgraded Costco's credit from A+ to AA-. The Wall Street Journal reports that Standard & Poor's had been considering a credit upgrade for Costco, but they pulled that after hearing about this borrowing move. But Steve, that would seem to indicate that raising taxes causes people to move money for personal gain at the expense of making the economy that's built to last. I can't understand this. It's utterly mysterious to me.
I can explain it to you very simply. Oh, wait, no, I can't. Did you say his last name is Sinegal?
Yes.
I thought you were saying cynical.
Oh,
cynical.
Steve
This
Green for the
whole
win.
episode, I've been misunderstood. No, this whole thing is a mutual protection racket. It's a hand-washing scheme. Big business loves big regulation and a complicated tax code because they've got the lawyers to deal with it. And small business doesn't. They're freezing out the competition. They're stifling innovation. That is the secret to our success in the 50s, that and the fact that Germany and Japan and Russia were rubble. And the other part of it is government gets moral protection because they can say, look, even these rich private capital enterprise people like it too. It's a mutual protection racket, and we're the ones who pay the price.
Precisely correct. Well, folks, liberals feel that they can legislate and lecture their way out of the laws of gravity and thermodynamics. All rhetoric and sophistry to them is driven in the cause of a utopian world. I just read from Evan Sayet that the word utopia means a world made up of words. Well, that's prevented from coming into its full glory by the vicissitudes of human nature and embodied in people like Jim Sinegal. Now, I don't fault Jim Sinegal for wanting to keep that extra $4 million a year, but how you can tell the rest of us, Mr. Sinegal, to bear a burden that you have hurt your shareholders' credit rating in order to avoid personally after a speech in Charlotte where you tried to cover yourself in the glory of unearned moral superiority? Well, I don't know how a man like you faces your wife, your children, or yourself. For PJTV, I'm Bill Woodall.